Hello and welcome. I'm Mark Winkworth, and you're listening to Tales of the Sea. A short time ago, one of my sisters was looking through a box of correspondence, letters from my father to his sister in the days following World War II. That's a lifetime ago, 83 years. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor having pulled America into the war. John Winkworth, my father, had enlisted in the Navy and reported for training in the winter of 1943. This was just over 2 years after he had married his high school sweetheart, my mom. My brother was 2 years old, and my older sister was just 6 months. My dad was 24 when he enlisted, and he, along with other young soldiers, had volunteered to face the growing escalation of the enemy offensive in Europe. My dad had been around the water his entire life. He grew up on the lakes of Michigan. In less troubled times as a young man, he had fished and boated in the waters of Lake St. Clair near Detroit, his boyhood home. I ventured that joining the Navy made sense for a young man with a love of the water. So after basic training, he was assigned as a lieutenant junior grade aboard the Guadalcanal, a Casablanca Class Escort Carrier. Now, the escort carrier, or escort aircraft carrier, also called a baby flat top in the United States Navy, was a smaller and slower type of aircraft carrier than a fleet carrier and had fewer planes. Escort carriers were often about half the length and weighed about a third as much as their larger cousins, the fleet carriers. So the ship was built in Vancouver, Washington, using a converted freighter hull, which was common practice at the time. The Guadalcanal was still well over a football field in length and displaced 7,800 tons. She carried a crew of 685, 47 officers and 638 enlisted seamen. After the Guadalcanal shakedown training, her captain, Daniel V. Gallery, executed the first fighter plane takeoff and landing aboard his new ship. The Guadalcanal was then used to perform pilot qualifications, including day and night takeoff and landings, as well as emergency ditch and rescue operations, while stationed in San Diego, California. The ship then departed on November 15, 1943, via the Panama Canal for Norfolk, Virginia, arriving in early December. In Norfolk, the Guadalcanal was designated the flagship of Task Group 22.3, a hunter-killer group of naval ships charged with hunting down and destroying enemy submarines in the Atlantic. The ship was then loaded with 9 FM-2 Wildcat fighter planes and 12 TBM-3 torpedo bombers, known as Avengers. On November 5, 1944, she set off to sea with her escort destroyers in search of enemy submarines in the North Atlantic. During World War II, Germany had built 1,162 U-boats, or German submarines, in order to attack merchant ships carrying supplies to Allied forces and to disrupt their war efforts. The German U-boats had terrifying intelligence capabilities and could actually access reports on the location, destination, and speed of the U.S. and British merchant ships. The submarine's main weapons were torpedoes. Each sub carried 22 of these ship killers, and by war's end, they had sunk more than 3,500 Allied ships. However, the Allies were able to develop new anti-submarine tactics and use technological advancements like radar and sonar to locate enemy U-boats. The Allies also improved their convoy system, organizing merchant ships to sail together under the protection of the British Navy. My brother and sisters have, over the years, discussed the fact that our dad rarely talked about the war, his experiences, or the dangers, the fear he may have felt. Well, maybe that was normal for the 1950s. For those men and women who served both at home and abroad, they wanted to get on with their lives after the trauma of wartime. So the article my sister found when she was going through some long-forgotten correspondence proved very special to our family. It provided a window into my dad's memories and experiences aboard the Guadalcanal during those harrowing days and nights at sea in search of the enemy. those days and nights of him missing our mother and his two young children, and the beautiful memories of the clear waters of Lake St. Clair. By the end of the war, 785 German U-boats had been destroyed, and the remaining surrendered or were scuttled to avoid surrender. My dad was a part of that story. And following the war, in October 1945, the Guadalcanal was stationed for a time in Pensacola, Florida. He was invited to be the guest speaker at a local meeting of the Junior Chamber of Commerce at the San Carlos Hotel. My dad, the young lieutenant, was asked to give a talk to tell the story of the carrier's anti-submarine work in the Atlantic Ocean, including details of the remarkable capture of the German enemy submarine U-505. One quick note here, you'll hear the term paper hanger referenced in my dad's remarks. This nickname was coined by a Cardinal Mundelein of Chicago in 1937 in reference to then-Chancellor Adolf Hitler's previous work experience as a house painter. The pejorative term for Herr Hitler was later used by General George Patton himself. You'll also hear the term Wolfpack when referring to German submarine tactics. During World War II, German U-boats were known as Wolfpacks because of how they hunted Allied ships. The British called the groups Wolfpacks because they used similar tactics to wolves, who often hunted by searching for lone prey, in this case, a ship that had strayed far from its convoy. Okay, let's get to it. The following is the address my father, Lieutenant Junior Grade John Winkworth, gave that day in the fall of 1945. I can't help but hear his voice as I read this. He was a quiet man and very thoughtful. And, well, it's good to hear his voice again. Good afternoon. Hunting U-boats is a unique and nerve-wracking business. For much of the time, it's a war of nerves. For what seem to be endless days and nights, our nerves are taut as the ships of our task group steam over an endless expanse of water. Imaginations start to work. Scuttlebutt rolls like a snowball, picking up stories all over the ship, until finally an officer solemnly advises you that our ship is believed to be right in the middle of a German submarine wolf pack, and that is now awaiting the fall of darkness to attack us. We were always on alert. But as the minutes, hours, and days run into weeks, the tension eases slightly, and everyone begins to think that maybe the German subs have gotten spooked and have been ordered back to the safety of the big concrete pens located on the German-occupied French coast. To be sure, there have been contacts in the area, but the ocean is also full of whales, and it's hard to distinguish between the two, the submarine and the whale, at least on the underwater sonar. The press has carried stories during the past week covering our ship's travels and actions during the war. I'd like to go back over her colorful career and fill in a few of the details for you. The Casablanca Class CVEs were built in Vancouver, Washington. Carriers were in desperate need for the Navy in early 1943, and it was hoped that these ships would fill the bill. How well they served that purpose is common knowledge today. But when the Guadalcanal was commissioned, these ships, made in Washington state, were an unknown quantity. So were their crews, for that matter. About 80% of the ship's company, officers and enlisted men, had never sailed. We were not long in being indoctrinated, however. Traveling with the Guadalcanal was the USS Ford, a destroyer escort and one of the few ships that survived the horrific battles in and around the Java Sea at the start of the war with Japan. The aircraft squadron aboard our ship consisted of fighters, known as Wildcats, and torpedo bombers, called Avengers. Now, these planes operated in weather that was as dirty as any I ever hoped to see. Rain, wind, the pitch of the carrier deck were formidable challenges. Yet patrols were launched and recovered with few interruptions. On occasion, too numerous to mention, the flights returned to the carrier to find rain and mist shrouding the entire flight deck, the only landing strip for hundreds of miles. Now, these men and all those that followed them proved to us the high caliber of naval aviation. Our ship tasted its first success with the sinking of 2 U-boats by fighter planes of the squadron. It's interesting to note that one of the submarines was in fact what we call a cow, a very large boat used for fueling the smaller ocean-going German submarines alongside. And this was a literal case of catching and destroying 2 birds with 1 stone. The remaining weeks of the cruise produced many alerts, but no further engagements. Looking back, we were all well satisfied with the results of our first efforts. After a short period in the Navy Yard for repairs, our ship headed out to sea for its second cruise. At this time, destroyer escorts of the diesel-electric type accompanied our ship, now nicknamed the Can-Do by our crew, to provide protection. These ships were a distinct improvement over the fuel-burning flush-deck destroyers. The fuel capacity of these destroyer escorts was sufficient to give these sturdy little ships the same cruising range as our ship, the Guadalcanal. This eliminated the necessity of performing the difficult and distinctly dangerous operation of fueling at sea. The men of the task group looked and acted like veterans. And when the word got around that we were on the trail of 2 U-boats, the crew rubbed their hands together and waited for action. Before long, we got it. After a 2-day chase on Easter Sunday morning, the German submarine U-515 was contacted, driven to the surface, and then destroyed. Sometimes we were in a bit of doubt as to who was chasing who. But when the enemy prisoners were brought aboard the Guadalcanal, the issue was settled. Before we even had time to paint out the Nazi flag on the bridge, the second enemy submarine was located and disposed of in similar fashion. The prisoners taken from the German sub U-515 were carefully questioned by our captain, who later informed us that the U-515 had an outstanding record and a commanding officer who had been decorated by the paper hanger himself. The circumstances of the sinking, the conduct of the men in rapidly abandoning their boat once it had been driven to the surface, led our captain to the formalization of his daring plan for the capture of an enemy submarine.
Yeah, I want to stop here for just a moment because when I first read these remarks my dad made that day, I got this strong image of him, all 5'9" of his really thin, now 26-year-old frame, and the really serious look he would have had on his face while listening to his captain lay out to his crew this daring and unquestionably dangerous plan. And I knew he'd be all in for the plan, but he'd also be thinking about my mom and the 2 young kids and how much he wanted one day to get back home to them. Okay, let's get back to my dad's talk he gave that day in Florida.
The events of our cruise are a familiar story, but I'd like to emphasize that long hours of planning went into the organization of the boarding party and its training. Every phase, every possible detail was gone over again and again. Actions to be taken by our aircraft, destroyer escorts, and our ship were coordinated into the overall plan. The boarding plan for the enemy sub was formed around key men whose experience qualified them in specialized fields. Special equipment was gathered, and these carefully laid plans soon paid off. The morning of June 4th brought our ship, the Guadalcanal, across the course of the enemy submarine U-505, under circumstances remarkably similar to those encountered with the U-515, even to it being on a Sunday. It was, however, a close call. The task group was just going into formation in preparation for the launching of our aircraft. The USS Chatelaine dropped astern to take up aircraft guard position and immediately made sound contact with the German submarine. The Chatelaine then dropped a pattern of depth charges simultaneously with the sounding of the general alarm aboard our ship. The German sub U-505 then launched a torpedo, but thanks to our alert escort, we were able to move out of the way at flank speed. At the order of the commander of the task group, our carrier and the escort vessels opened fire with light guns on the sub after it had been driven to the surface by depth charges. Our fighter planes assisted the destroyer escorts in locating the enemy sub and driving it to the surface. The combined firepower of the escorts and the fighter planes was too much for the crew of the sub. The German crew quickly abandoned the idea of fighting back and instead jumped into the water. Here was the moment we had been waiting for. The call went out to the entire fleet. Away boarders! And history was in the making. The boarding party from the USS Pillsbury reached the German sub first, followed closely by the men from our ship, the Guadalcanal. The boarding party went over, prepared for a fight, but the submarine had been completely abandoned. The boarding party found the crew of the sub had made preparations to scuttle, to sink the sub, but the boarding party arrived in time to close the sea valves before buoyancy was completely lost, preventing the sub from sinking. Picture yourself, gentlemen, going below on a submarine when you couldn't be sure, but in the next instant, you might find yourself and the sub plunging to the bottom of the ocean. It took cold nerve to do what the boarding party accomplished. Demolition charges were exactly where the experts said they would be found. The significance of the capture of the German sub U-505 was not only that the sub was intact, but that not one piece of equipment, not one record or log had been destroyed. Everything was there. It was dangerous work, and the results were not certain until the U-boat had been towed across the Atlantic in secret, using ingenious camouflage, and safely moored on the island of Bermuda. This is the critical part. With the capture of the German submarine U-505, the German U-boat Navy no longer had any secrets as far as we were concerned. But our secret was well kept. To the best of our knowledge, the news of the capture never did leak out. The conduct of the U-boat war after the capture of the U-505 bears out this belief. From that point on, the German Navy was conducting a war under the seas with the U.S. Navy and its allies reading right out of the same playbook, from that day until the end of the European War. It's a bit of a handicap as far as the enemy was concerned, but mighty helpful to this country. The escorts, carriers, and composite squadrons actually worked themselves out of a job prior to VE Day. So well did they handle their assigned tasks in the Atlantic.
Maybe my dad paused here to remember the victory and significant changes in the war from that point on. To remember that he had been there on the scene. Now, as the talk continued, his tone serious, no doubt. Perhaps he even leaned in a bit toward his audience at this point.
Let me ask all of you here today to visualize the overall significance of the victory over the German undersea fleet. Had the battle gone the other way, perhaps ultimate victory would have been unattainable. Winston Churchill, during the early days of the war, stated that he believed the winner of the Battle of the Atlantic would win the war. The German submarine was a deadly threat to our lifeline in the ocean. Not only vital supplies and fighting equipment was at stake, but even more important, the lives of thousands of our Allied fighting men. The Guadalcanal Task Group 22.3 was responsible for destroying 8 enemy subs. Those subs, in turn, were responsible for sinking almost 40 Allied ships, including troop transports. Left unchecked, these German subs might very likely have tipped the balance of the war the other way. The German Navy lost 750 submarines in this war. A large percentage were credited to the escort carrier task groups. This war has been a secret weapon war. There have been the German V-1 and V-2 rockets, the buzz bombs, the Japanese kamikaze attack corps, but the U.S. Navy had their secret weapons as well. We said at the beginning of this talk that the CVE escort carrier was an unknown quantity in 1943. Pacific veterans will tell you of the fine record the escort carriers have established in that theater. Without question, their part in the Battle of the Atlantic was the deciding factor. Gentlemen, I propose to you the Navy's secret weapon, the escort carrier. Thank you.
And with that, the young lieutenant concluded his remarks. It's amazing to me that over 80 years have passed since that day in October when my father gave this account to the assembled members of the Junior Chamber of Commerce. Even more amazing is that this is the first time I've ever read my father's accounting of those days. As I said, like so many who served in World War II, my father rarely, if ever, spoke of this time in the service, except to say how hard it was to be away from my mom and his family. One of the few occasions he did talk about those years was during a visit to the Chicago Museum of Science and Industry's remarkable exhibit of the captured German submarine, the U-505, in June of 2006. Back in 1955, the submarine that my dad had a hand in capturing and bringing across the ocean came to rest in Chicago on the grounds of the Museum of Science and Industry by way of the Erie Canal and a long trip through Michigan's Great Lakes. The German sub had made a brief stop in Detroit, where my father took my brother and I down to visit the captured vessel. I have a vivid memory of being inside the sub. It was small and dirty and really claustrophobic. It was pretty much as the boarding party had left it. Having endured nearly 50 years of cold and wet Chicago winters, the U-505 finally found a permanent home in 2004. On the 75th anniversary of the museum, a new indoor exhibit hall was dedicated and open to the public. It was an amazing feat of engineering. A massive pit was dug, the sub was lowered into the ground, and the exhibit then built around it in 2 levels. The care taken to maintain its original state from the control room to the living quarters is a testament to the museum's commitment to authenticity and historical accuracy. On one wall of the exhibition, a large plaque honors the names of all of those responsible for the successful capture and return of the German sub U-505. We stood with my dad as he looked at his name there among his fellow sailors. Proud of you, Dad. That ends this episode of Tales of the Sea. As always, if you enjoyed this episode, please tell a friend or two. And remember, you can find Tales of the Sea wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. I'm Mark Winkworth. Thanks for listening.